All right. Good day, good morning, good evening, good night to you, wherever and whenever you're watching me. This is your brother and friend Maurice. What are we talking about? Well, we are continuing our series of studies on the passing away of the heavens and earth. Our topic is Last Days Deception and Persecution. You're watching the new Kosmos Videocast.
This is the new Kosmos Videocast. You've never heard it like this anywhere. Welcome.
And welcome. We are continuing our series on the theme, the passing away of the heavens and earth, and this is the 8th video of this series. And to see the previous 7 videos, I will put the link right up here. Or if I forget, you may visit the new Kosmos Videocast channel and look in the playlist, The Passing Away of the Heavens and Earth. Also, let me encourage you to sign up for membership on patreon.com/newcosmos. There are 4 membership tiers, and if you choose the 2nd, the 3rd, or the 4th tiers, you can have access to my videos before they are released on YouTube up to 2 weeks ahead. Additionally, the 3rd or 4th tiers give you access to the New Kosmos Master Class. Now, by way of review, last study we looked at how Jesus confirmed that the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and its temple were the sign of the end of the age. The disciples, nor Christ, spoke about any 2,000-year future end or last days. What they spoke about was the last days which were prophesied in the law and the prophets. The end of the age that was prophesied in the law and the prophets, which placed that end, which placed those last days at the time when the city and the temple were destroyed at the end of the Old Covenant age, which was prophesied in Daniel 9 verses 26 to 27. So our topic today is Last Days Deception and Persecution, and this is going to be a part 1 and a part 2. We are looking at how Jesus's predictions in Matthew 24 were fulfilled by historical record. All right, so we have historical record of how what Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 came to pass. Okay, so remember in Matthew 24, let's go there in our Bible, read verse 1, 2, and 3. Matthew 24 verses 1, 2, and 3, Jesus left the temple and was going away. And when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, but he answered them, "You see all these," meaning all the buildings of the temple, "do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here," meaning at the site of the temple, "one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Mark 13 verse 3 says these were 4 disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, okay, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" Meaning, when will the temples of the buildings of the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign of your coming? The word here is parousia, meaning presence. So if there's a sign needed, that means the presence would be invisible, right? As is usual, the presence of the Lord is not visible for the natural eye. Okay, it is something that needs to be discerned. And of the end of the age. This would be the age of the sacrifices and offerings which went all the way back to Adam. Okay, that age was about to end. So in answer to this threefold question, Jesus listed out several things. You notice in verse 4 it says, "And Jesus answered them." Okay, so everything that Jesus says below verse 3, is in answer to this threefold question. All right? And if we, last study, we looked at verses 34 and 35, yes, where Jesus placed the the fulfillment of the things asked in verse 3 in the generation of those same disciples. Notice he says in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. These things must include the question which was asked, when will the temple buildings be thrown down? Okay? And so all these things included that and would be accomplished in that generation to whom Jesus was speaking, of the disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, their generation. These things would take place, and the heaven and earth will pass away in that generation as well. Okay? So that we have the modern narrative which denies this. Okay? The modern narrative denies that the things that Jesus talked about, or at least some, most, or whatever percentage, depends on which denomination you listen to, depend on which teacher you're listening to. But for the majority of the Christian church on a whole, they deny that all things that Jesus spoke about took place in that generation. Notice Jesus says, when you see all these things, go back to the Bible, verse 33. So also when you see all these things. Good? So all these things mean from verse 4 to verse 33, including the destruction of the temple and the city, right? That was to happen in that generation. As I said, the modern church denies that all these things, they may say some happened, because there's no doubt that the temple and the city of Jerusalem were destroyed. But not all things. Okay, that's the modern church's understanding. My understanding is that Jesus was correct. After all, Jesus cannot be wrong. Good? If Jesus was wrong about this, then he was wrong about everything. Good? The fulfillment of this prophecy proved that he was the Lord, right? Because it was the coming of the Lord, right? In judgment to Jerusalem. Good? So the modern Christian is skeptical about whether Jesus came to Jerusalem as he had promised, right? And fortunately for us, there is historical reporting, right? And based on that historical report, I can clearly say, I can confidently state that Israel's old covenant heavens and earth passed away in that very generation, just according to Jesus' word, which was accomplished in the year 70. Now you might ask, well, what historical reporting, what historical record are you speaking about? Well, there are two main categories of historical record we have. First, we have an inspired historical record, which is the writings of the apostles and the Acts of the Apostles, right, in the New Testament section of your Bible. Good? So that's one record. And then you have what you might call a secular or uninspired record, which I will use the works of the Jewish historian Josephus, who lived at the time of the apostolic ministry. Okay? So that we can have an inspired record and an uninspired record. Josephus was not an apostle. Okay? So let's see how, and I said this is going to be a two-part because we can't get through the entire Matthew 24. So I'm going to do half of it, and the second half I will do in the next study. All right? So Jesus answered them. He answered them. Okay? The 4 disciples who were there sitting with him, as verse 3 says, privately. The 4 disciples were there sitting with him privately. So he's speaking to them. And then he says, see that no one leads you astray. Specifically them. Obviously, we know that they would relay this to the other disciples, right? But I want to keep your mind in the context of the audience that Jesus was speaking to. He was saying that, he was telling them, see that no one leads you all, astray. Okay? For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Okay? So now, these people whom Jesus warned about, many that will come in his name saying he's the Christ and lead many astray, were these people that Jesus mentioned here and warned about, were they to appear thousands of years later? Or were they people that the disciples were to look out for? Well, obviously, if Jesus is answering them and he's telling them, see that no one leads you astray, then these that would come in his name and lead many astray were for his disciples to look out for those very disciples would witness them. Right? Now, do we have historical record of this happening? Of course. Now remember I said the Acts of the Apostles and the writings of the apostles record these things being fulfilled in the time of the apostles. For example, let's look at Acts chapter 5 verses 36 and 37, right? Acts chapter 5 verses 36 and 37. You see, when we, let me use myself as an example. When I became a Christian and the Bible was being taught to me, and we were reading Matthew 24, for example, and when Jesus says, be careful, be aware that no one leads you astray, it was never told to me that Jesus was speaking to 4 disciples in front of him. The way that was presented to me is that Jesus said to me and to us in the 21st century, beware that no one leads you astray. And obviously that is true, right? That we should be aware that no one leads us astray. But the fact of the matter that the way that was taught to me led me astray. Because it was never said, it was never mentioned to me, and I don't even think that the people who taught me knew either, that Jesus was warning the disciples about these people who would lead them or seek to lead them astray. Okay? Yes, an application could be made to us in our time, but the people to whom Jesus was really issuing this warning, and he had a reason why he was issuing the warning to them. Okay? So look at verse 36. It says, before these days, this is Acts chapter 5, verse 36, for before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. You notice that? 400 is a lot of people. 400 joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. So Theudas was one of those who came and said he was the Christ, right? He didn't say he was Jesus, because the Christ is a title. The Christ, the Messiah, the Christos, the Mashiach, right? So he came and said he was the Christ. 400 people. And Theudas was a Jew. So these were 400 Jews followed him, joined him. But he ended up being killed and he came to nothing. So here we have people rising up as Christs and drawing people away. Recorded in the book of Acts. Right? So we have a historical record of Jesus' words coming to pass. Right? But also we have in the writings of the apostles, where you had, yes, with Theudas, you had deception without or outside of the early church. But you had deception also within the early church. And the Apostle Paul pointed it out in Galatians 3. Right? Galatians 3. Look what Paul wrote. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has what? Bewitched you." Right? So here we have a form of deception. Right? A form of deception that the church at Galatia was experiencing. What was that deception? It says, "It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." Let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? This was the deception. Because the Jewish Christians were seeking to bring the Gentile Christians under the Old Covenant law. Now, the Jewish Christians, by virtue of them being born into the Old Covenant, they were obligated to the Old Covenant until the end of the age. But the Gentiles and the new Christians that were coming into the church, they were not to be bound or obligated in any way to the Old Covenant, right? But the Jewish Christians were saying that, hey, you cannot receive the Spirit unless you keep the law. And so Paul said, did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Obviously, the answer is by the hearing of faith or by hearing with faith. Look what he says. Are you so foolish? Are you deceived? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now perfected by the flesh? Meaning, are you going to go back to the works of the law? No. He says, did you suffer so many things in vain? If indeed it was in vain, does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Notice, what was the challenge there? The works of the law, the old covenant, or hearing with faith, the new covenant. Just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. Okay? So note, Paul made it clear that the sons of Abraham were those who were of faith, both Jew and Gentile. But the Jews were seeking to bring the Gentiles in the name of Jesus now, in the name of Christ, into an old covenant relationship. That was a deception. That was a deception as well. Good? So we had the two types of deception. We have deception without, right? The Jews being led away by these people rising up as messiahs. But we also had the Gentiles being led away by the Christian Jews who want to bring these the Gentile Christians under the law, which they were not supposed to. The apostles in Acts chapter 15 issued a decree that said the Gentiles must never be brought under the bondage to the old covenant law. So here we have Jesus's words, Jesus's predictions being fulfilled in the historical record of the book of Acts and the writings of the apostles. Let's move on. So we go back to Matthew 24 and continue. Verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Now, Jesus said here, but the end is not yet. Okay? Clever folk assume that because Jesus said at the time the disciples were hearing of the wars and rumors of wars, that the end was not yet. They assume Jesus meant that the end would be thousands of years away. But remember, when you come down to verse 34, look what Jesus said. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And then heaven and earth will pass away. So in that generation, the end would come. Now, a biblical generation is 40 years, right? But the end would come in that generation. Good? Not thousands of years away. So, you see, once you put everything that Jesus said together, you don't leave out some. You don't take this part here, but the end is not yet. And then leave out where he says, but everything must be fulfilled in that generation. Right? So the end would be at the end of the generation. All Jesus is saying, the end of the generation is not yet. The end of the age is not yet. Good? So the wars and rumors, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Okay? So during that time, during that period of time, after Jesus resurrected, went back to the Father, sent the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, between the day of Pentecost in the year 30 and the destruction of the temple and the city in the year 70, that 40-year generation, that's when you had all these things happening from Matthew 24, right? That's when you had so the end was in 70, but you had 40 years of these events. Now, 40 years is a pretty long time, right? It's a pretty long time in terms of human lifespan. Good? But does the Bible, does the historical record speak of wars and rumors of wars during this period of time? Yes, it does. For example, in Acts, let's look at Acts chapter 11, verse 28. Acts chapter 11, verse 28. Let's see what that says there, right? We're looking at the historical record. We're looking at the inspired historical record. Acts chapter 11, verse 28. Look what it says there now. It says, we can read from verse 27. It says, now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them named Agabus stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. So here are the famines. You shall hear of wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, and earthquakes. Right? Here is one of the prophets coming from Jerusalem, and he's predicting there would be a great famine in all the world. Now, people say, oh, well, he's talking about a famine that would come thousands of years later. No, look what it says in the very next sentence. It says, this took place in the days of Claudius. All right? Prophecy fulfilled. What Jesus was talking about, Acts 11:28, prophecy fulfilling. Good. Let's go on. Let's look at Acts 16 and read verse 26. Acts 16:26. And suddenly there was a what? A great, not just an ordinary normal earthquake now. Not just an old regular tremor. Not just the normal, what's the normal? A 5 point something on the Richter scale. It says this was a great earthquake, so that the foundation of the prison, the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were open and everyone's bonds were unfastened. So this earthquake was so great that it actually shook out the iron fastenings that kept the chains of the prisoners to the wall. So this wasn't an ordinary earthquake. This was a great earthquake. Jesus predicted, Matthew 24 verses 6 and 7, earthquakes. Here the book of Acts is recording earthquakes. But today, in the 21st century, earthquake happens in Japan, California, Indonesia. We had earthquakes in Turkey. And they say, that's the earthquakes that Jesus is talking about. They would say, oh, Jesus said that the earthquakes would increase and get more and more violent. No, Jesus never said that. There is no way you will find that Jesus said we will have more and more earthquakes and they will get more and more stronger and more frequent. He never said that. Right? But that is how the modern church has to put it across, because they realize that for 2,000 years we have been having earthquakes. We have been having earthquakes for 2,000 years. Right? But Jesus was not talking about earthquakes throughout all eternity. He was talking about earthquakes that the 4 disciples would see in their generation, letting them know that Jesus' words were true and they should keep the faith, because they would be, during that time, suffering immense persecution from their Jewish brethren. Right? So they needed something for their faith to hold on to. And that would be the fulfillment of prophecy happening in their day. Good? Anyway, let's continue. So we saw there the earthquakes that Jesus prophesied. Let's move on to the uninspired historical record, which is written by Josephus, right? And I want to show you during that time, because Josephus is writing during the same period of time, the same 40-year period. We have works from Josephus which outline also that within the Roman Empire, within the world, which is the oikoumene, right? There were the other nations within that. So Judea was in that oikoumene, or in that world, that is the Roman Empire. But they had other nations, they had Germany and so on, right? Samaria. You had these nations were also acting up, right? Wars and rumors of wars. Okay, so we'll look at the book, The Wars of the Jews, and we'll read book 7, chapter 4. I'm going to just read from here. It said, but before this time, and while Vespasian was a Roman general who later became Caesar. He later became Caesar. He later became the emperor of Rome, right? While Vespasian was about Alexandria, and Titus, which is Vespasian's son, was lying at the siege of Jerusalem, a great multitude of the Germans were in commotion. So notice the Germans were in commotion and tended to rebellion. And as the Gauls in their neighborhood joined with them. So you had the Germans and the Gauls rising up. Historically, wars and rumors of wars, right? Wars and rumors of wars. It says down here, besides these motives, it was the opportunity that now offered itself, which above all the rest prevailed with them to so do. For when they saw the Roman government in great internal disorder by the continual changes of its rulers. So what was happening, a lot of the Caesars were either being murdered or they were dying. So at that time, you had several Caesars in quick succession. So when you have these rulers being changed so frequently and at such a short space of time, then the empire was now becoming unstable, being destabilized, right? And so the states, the nations that were in the Roman Empire under subjection of Rome, they began to rise up, right? Because they realized that there is a chance that they can throw off the Roman yoke, so to speak, because they're beginning to see Rome seemed to be losing power. Okay, so it says, when they saw the Roman government in great internal disorder by the continual changes of its rulers, and understood that every part of the habitable earth, that word there would most likely be the oikoumene, which your King James would translate as world, under them was in an unsettled and tottering condition. They thought that this was the best opportunity that could afford itself for themselves to make a sedition when the state of the Romans was so ill. Okay, see that? So Josephus was writing and recording this in the time of the apostles. This is a fulfillment of what Jesus said. Not like today. We look out and we say, oh, Israel is bombing Hezbollah, Israel is bombing Syria, and Israel is bombing Iran, and Hamas is bombing Israel, and Ukraine is bombing Russia, and Russia is bombing Ukraine. And we say, that's what Jesus talked about. That wasn't what Jesus was talking about. The wars and the rumors of wars, Jesus said, you, meaning the 4 disciples that were sitting there listening to him, he says, you will hear, you, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, you guys will hear of wars and rumors of wars. He says the end is not yet, because the end would come in the year 70, not 2,000 years later, right? You gotta be careful to keep your context when you're reading, right? It is very tempting to jump out of the context and look at what is happening in our time. But Jesus was not speaking about our time. And I know that's very hard for some of you to hear because you have a lot invested in believing that Jesus was talking about our time. You have a lot invested. Some of you have a lot invested denominationally, right? Because that's what your denomination is all about. Some of you have a lot invested in terms of your ministry, because you may have a ministry that talks about last day events, right? And so when you hear this, you know, it's like your world is turned upside down, because as you are being convicted of the truth, you realize you got to go and do some housekeeping now. You got to do some major renovation. But I did it. And believe you me, is nothing better than knowing that you can sleep peacefully with your conscience free, knowing that you are going according to the Word of God. Let's look at another instance here of Josephus. So we're going to look at Wars of the Jews, book 4, chapter 4 and 5. All right? Wars of the Jews, book 4, chapter 4 and 5. It says here, "For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with utmost violence and very strong winds, and the largest showers of rain, with continued lightnings, terrible thunderings, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth, that was in an earthquake." So you had here an earthquake combined with this kind of a hurricane. Okay? It says these things, this is what Josephus concluded now. He says these things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men. When the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshowed some grand calamities that were coming. Right? Josephus was a Jew. And Josephus saw this terrible storm and this terrible earthquake that happened in Jerusalem. And he concluded this is a bad omen. He said, this is bad. Something bad is coming upon Jerusalem. Calamities are coming upon Jerusalem. But it is a fulfillment of Jesus' words as well. Let's look at another one here. Wars of the Jews, book 6, chapter 3. It says here, "Now, of those that perish by famine in the city," this is in Jerusalem. Notice there was a famine in Jerusalem here. "The number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war commenced presently." So you have war and you have famine. "And the dearest friends fell a fighting one with another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable support of life. Nor would men believe that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest anyone should have concealed food in their bosoms." Right? So here we had famine, we have war. These are the things that Jesus said would happen during that time, leading up to the destruction. You remember, the question is, when will these things, the destruction of Jerusalem, be? Josephus is writing before the destruction of Jerusalem, right? But after Jesus' predictions. So he's writing in that period between 30 and 70. And he's telling you about wars and rumors of wars. He's telling you about earthquakes. He's telling you about storms. He's telling you about famines. But the modern Christian is today. We have deadly hurricanes. But the hurricanes that are happening today and the earthquakes that are happening today and the famines, where we do hardly hear about famines anymore. But there was a time when we had famines happening. North Korea had famine. We had Ethiopia and some of these African nations had famines. But those were not the famine that Jesus talked about. The famine Jesus talked about was that which the disciples would see before or leading up to the destruction of the temple buildings. All right? Let's move on with our Bible. In Matthew 24. Matthew 24, we are at verse 8. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you. Who? You know, again, when I was a young Christian, they would scare us and say, look, they would come and they will be arresting you, the members of your denomination, and they will carry you and charge you, right? Because according to our denomination, the government will make laws that are against religion. And so if you practice your religion, you will be arrested, brought before the trial, right? And then you'll be put to death for keeping God's commandments. And they would use this text here, then they will deliver you. But who is the you that Jesus is speaking about here? Wasn't us in the 21st century. It was the disciples. It was the apostles. It was the early church. Then they, and the they here were their own Jewish brothers and sisters. Their own Jewish brothers and sisters would deliver the Christians, because remember, the first Christians were Jews. The first Christians were Jews who believed that Jesus is the Son of the living God, who believed that Jesus was the Messiah that God sent. Not speaking to you today. So the Jewish brothers and sisters would deliver up the Jewish Christians up to tribulation and put them to death. It says, and you, the early church Christians, will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Persecution of the church. And many denominations use these verses to develop their persecution complex. So they are always expecting this persecution. Now they have persecution that happens, but mainly in the Islamic nations where Christianity is illegal, or at least it is illegal for a Muslim to become a Christian. So in both cases, if you have somebody convert from Islam to Christianity, they are going to be persecuted. They're going to be killed most likely. Or if you have somebody who is a Christian who maybe is witnessing to a Muslim, that also is going to cause problems. Good? But generally, in the Western world, there's no persecution. Hardly. But in any case, even if there is or will be or has been, that's not what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was talking about his disciples and the early church, the Jewish church, which was delivered up to tribulation by their Jewish brothers and sisters. They were brought before the Sanhedrin and tried as heretics and blasphemers. And that is historically recorded in the Bible. So let's look at Acts chapter 5, verse 17 and 18 for a historical record of how Jesus' words came true in the time of the disciples. So we're going to go to Acts chapter 5 and read 17 and 18. Look what it says. But the high priest rose up. So the high priest was the high priest of the Jews, right? The high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is, the party of the Sadducees, and were filled with jealousy. They arrested who? The apostles. These were the same people that Jesus was talking to in Matthew 24, saying that they would be delivered up for tribulation. Well, here's the fulfillment. They arrested the apostles, put them in public prison, And during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out and said, go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life. Right? So here we have the words of Christ being fulfilled. The apostles, which were the disciples, they were arrested. Let's go down, let's follow the story in verse 27. And when they had brought them, that's the apostles who were arrested, were brought, they set them before the council. Now the word council here is Sanhedrin. Let me show you it in the lexicon. You see it there? Sunidrion. Right? It says there, the Sanhedrin, the great council were at Jerusalem. This is where Jesus said they would be delivered up to the council. The Sanhedrin. Good? Anyway, let's come back to the Bible. The council at Jerusalem, and the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in this name, that is in the name of Jesus, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Fulfillment of Jesus' words. Jesus said they will deliver you up to the council, and they will put you to death. Let's look at Acts chapter 12, verse 1. So we're still in the book of Acts. Let's go to chapter 12. Verse 1, and about that time, Herod the king, now Herod was the king of the Jews, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. That's what Jesus predicted. Persecution would come upon the disciples. Matthew 24, 8-10. It's written there in your Bible. You have the historical fulfillment of Jesus' words. Look at what Paul said in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, verse 36. Paul says, as it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Jesus said they would be killed, brought before the council, delivered up, beaten, scourged, killed, prophecy fulfilled. Right? But we are looking for stuff to happen today. Why? Why are we ignoring the fulfillment of prophecy that's already there in the inspired record for some future coming which Christ never talked about, never had in mind? Look at verse 11, Matthew 24. Let's go back to Matthew 24. So we went through that. They will deliver you up, put you to death, and so on. Many shall follow, and so on. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. False prophets. Again, he began by talking about those who will come deceiving. Now here again he mentions false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Well, we have many false prophets today, leading many people astray. And many people are being led astray on this specific topic of the end of the age and the parousia of Christ, right? But Jesus wasn't talking about us today, specifically. He was talking about the disciples in their time. They would arise false prophets in their time to lead many astray. And the historical inspired record records that this indeed happened. Right? For example, let's look at 2 Peter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. 2 Peter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. Look what Peter said. But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies. Now, you had false prophets already, and there will be more, according to Peter. But where would these more would come? It says, among you, the people to whom Peter was writing to the early church. He said you had false prophets among the people, and there will also be false teachers among you. Let's continue. He says, and many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of truth will be blasphemed, and in their greed they will exploit you meaning the people to whom Peter was writing. The condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. As a matter of fact, in verse 1, he says, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. So you remember, Peter was one of the disciples who was there on the Mount of Olives when Jesus gave his prediction, saying that false prophets shall arise and deceive many. Peter's saying the same thing. Now look at John. Remember, John was one of the 4 disciples also there. Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Look at what John wrote now. 1 John 4, reading from verses 1 to 3. It says, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are of God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. So John was saying, Jesus' words have been fulfilled. Jesus says, false prophets shall arise and lead many astray. John is saying, yes, the false prophets have arrived and gone out into the world to lead many astray. Fulfillment of Jesus' words. But that's not enough for some of us. That's not enough. No, the false prophets in our time are what Jesus was speaking about, according to some of us. Let's continue with John. John says, by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. What? Here we have the apostle. The Holy Spirit inspired apostle saying to you that the Antichrist had already come in the time of John, but we are still today looking for this Antichrist. Several years ago, it was the King of England. Then it was the Anglican Church. Then it was the Catholic Church. Then it was the papacy. Then coming down, it was the Enlightenment people, right? Then it was coming on to these political leaders. So Tony Blair was the Antichrist. We heard Barack Obama was the Antichrist. Bill Clinton was the Antichrist. George Bush was the Antichrist. Donald Trump is the Antichrist. Every year, we have a different Antichrist. But John, we don't want to believe John. You see, because in our mind, John is one of these false prophets, it seems. Because John is telling us that the Antichrist, which they had heard was to come, was now, meaning in his time, in the world already. But we don't want to believe that, right? Because we have this narrative of this Antichrist who's supposed to come and take over the whole world and rule the whole world and whatever fantastical fearmongering we have concerning that. That's not found in the Bible. John said that the false prophets that Jesus talked about, he was seeing them. Prophecy was fulfilling in their time. Look what John also said. 1 John chapter 2. Verse 18, John was there when Jesus gave these events for them to look for. Verse 18, he says, children, it is the last hour. Now, last in my understanding means you're at the end of something. If today is the last day of the week, then you can't have the last day of the week extending for the next 2,000 years. That last day of the week has to end at the end of the 24 hours. That day has to end at the end of the 24 hours. It can't be a million-hour day. Similarly, John is saying this is the last hour. This means we are at the end. After this has ended, they will have a new something. Good? Just like when you have the week ending, then you have a new week starting. When you have the year ending, then you have a new year starting. Similarly, they were at the end of the age. And when that age ended, you will have a new one beginning. But no, the modern Christian church is of the opinion that the last hour that John speaks of here, spoke of here, is still ongoing. For 2,000 years, it's still the last hour for many Christians. You see, doesn't make any sense. But listen why John says it's the last hour. He says it is the last hour, and as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so they heard that Antichrist was coming in their time. They didn't hear that Antichrist was coming 2,000 years later. They heard Antichrist was coming in their time, in the time of the apostles, that 40-year period between 30 and 70. They heard Antichrist was coming in that generation. So now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know it is the last hour. It is very difficult for me to understand how people could read these texts and come away with the impression that the apostles did not mean these things. Come away with the impression that they were not speaking to the people of their time, but they were speaking to us 2,000 years later. That's very arrogant, really. That's really arrogant of us to think that, right? That no, they weren't speaking to the people in their time. The people who were actually being persecuted, the people who were actually being delivered up, the people who were actually dying, the people who were actually having a tribulation, no, Jesus' words were not for them. They're for us who live in today comfortably, going to church without any problems, being able to speak freely on YouTube, on radio, on television, on the street corner. We're able to preach the gospel and have our church meetings freely. No, he was speaking to us who have no persecution whatsoever. That doesn't make any kind of sense, right? Does not make any kind of sense. But let's continue. Verse 12 of Matthew 24. Jesus said, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. The lack of love and the abounding of iniquity. Let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 to 16. Verses 14 to 16. Look what the apostle wrote there. It says, for you brothers, that's the members of the church at Thessalonica, became imitators of the churches of God in Jesus Christ that are in Judea. Okay? So the churches in Thessalonica imitated the churches in Judea. Okay? Talking about the early church. You're talking about the apostolic church. For you, the church in Thessalonica, suffered the same things from your own countrymen as they, the church in Judea, did from the Jews. So you notice whom Paul pointed out as the instigators of the persecution. You notice whom Paul pointed out as the ones who were carrying out the persecution of the Jewish Christians. They were their own Jewish brothers and sisters. But because the Jewish Christians believed that Jesus was the Son of the living God, they were viewed by their Jewish brothers and sisters as heretics and blasphemers. And so they made them suffer. And it says, Paul speaking here about the Jews says, they killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us, meaning the apostles, out and displeased God and opposed all mankind by hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles that they might be saved, so as always to fill up the measure of their sins. But what? Wrath has come upon them at last. So Paul was seeing something. Paul, at the time he was writing to the Thessalonians, was seeing something happening to the Jewish people in his time, that he said, the wrath has come upon them at last. But the prophecy of Jesus was being fulfilled. Right? The Jewish brothers and sisters did not love their brothers and sisters who accepted Jesus as the Son of God. Remember, Jesus says, the love of many will turn cold and iniquity will abound, right? So here is exactly that being fulfilled. When the Jews persecuted their own brothers and sisters and killed their brothers and sisters, that was their love was growing cold. And in killing their brothers and sisters who accepted Jesus as the Son of the living God and the Messiah, they were actually sinning against God. Notice it says, when the Jews killed the prophets, killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and drove out the apostles, they displeased God. Their iniquity was abounding. It says they were filling up the measure of their sins. Again, here is Jesus' words being fulfilled right in the very Bible that we use and preach, that these things are still far off into the future. We are still looking for them to happen. In the same Bible, it's telling you these things have already been done. They've already been fulfilled. It's the same Bible many are using to preach to say, no, they are to come still. They are still to happen. Let's continue in Matthew 24. We're reading now from verse 13. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. Then the end will come. Oh, this one. Well, I know the denomination that I had been baptized into, they would use this verse and they would say, well, oh, the tribes in the Amazon have not been reached. And some of these nations that are under lockdown, like North Korea, it says, they have not been reached, and we have to reach. And so they put up satellite channels so that the gospel can be beamed around the world. And so everybody in the world can hear the gospel, and then Jesus would come. That is not what Jesus was talking about. That was not what Jesus was talking about. You see, when we read the Bible as if it was written yesterday, we fail to understand what the authors meant. And even the translators of what these men said and wrote err by using some of these words that they choose. For example, the whole world here. In the Greek, that word world is sorry, I didn't have the Bible up. When the translators render this as the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world, when you and I hear that or read that, we are thinking, oh, the whole of the world, as in the whole earth, and all the people in the Amazon jungle and the people in North Korea and all of the different non-Christian countries and so on, all over the place. We are thinking that. And we are thinking about the whole world in our time. But remember, again, context and audience relevance. Jesus was talking to his disciples. He was talking to them about something that would happen in their generation. He was talking to them of things that they would see. Right? And so the whole world here did not include the tribes in the Amazon jungle if they were existing at that time, by the way. Just let me show you. Number one, the word world here is the word oikumene. And the oikumene means the inhabited earth, the portion of the earth inhabited by the Greeks, in distinction from the lands of the barbarians, the Roman Empire and all subjects of the empire, right? This was the context of the whole world. And again, just to show you an example of how the word world was used in those days, let me show you Acts chapter 17, verse 1 to 7, right? Let's just read Acts chapter 7. So we go into the historical record now, right? Reading from Acts 17, 1-7. Now when they, that is the apostles, Paul and Silas, had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as his custom was, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. So here Paul is giving the gospel of the kingdom to Jews in Thessalonica. Okay? Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks. So you had Greek proselytes attending this synagogue, plus you had the Jewish worshippers there, right? Some of the Jews were persuaded and they joined Paul and Silas. That means they believed that Jesus is the Christ. And you had a great many of the Greek proselytes now who also believed, joined Paul and Silas. And not a few of the leading women. So the leading women also. So Paul was here increasing the church, but he was depleting the synagogue, right? So as a result, the Jews were jealous. And taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. Now, Jason was the owner of the house, okay, where Paul and Silas stayed. So it says, and when they could not find them, they could not find Paul and Silas, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have turned the world, notice that now, these men have turned the world. Now let's look at what word that is. It's the oikomene. Good? The same word that Jesus used in Matthew 24:14 to say this gospel must be preached in all the world. Here in Acts chapter 17 verse 6, you have the people of that world testifying that the apostles have turned that same world upside down. It says these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. So you understand the use of the word world there does not mean the entire planet. The world there was the world of the Jew, the Jewish world, right? And you remember, Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That was the world he was sent to, right? And to join that world as a Gentile, you had to be circumcised and become a proselyte. So that's why you had the Greek proselytes there at the synagogue. Just like when we looked at Nebuchadnezzar's world in Isaiah 13, Nebuchadnezzar's world, the world of Babylon, was judged. It was overthrown. Its heavens were shaken. Its earth was moved out of place. That was the world of Babylon, the Babylon Empire. Now you have the world where Jerusalem was. That was the Roman Empire. That was the oikomene. That world where Jerusalem was, that world where Judea was, that world in which the Jews lived. That was the world that was being turned upside down. Not the people down in the Amazon jungle. Reading in context, reading and understanding the type of document that you're reading. The Bible is an ancient Near East text. And so you have to read it, taking that into consideration, that how they used words, you can't take those words and just translate them straight into English without giving an explanation as to what they were really talking about. Let's look at Colossians 1, verses 5, 6, and 23. Let's get an idea about this world. Colossians 1, verse 5, 6, and 23. Look what the apostle wrote. Because of the hope laid up for you in heaven, of this you have heard before in the word of truth, the gospel. Paul is talking about the gospel, okay? The word of truth, the gospel, which has come to you. Come to who? The people at Colossae, the church at Colossae, the Colossian church. The gospel has come to the Colossians, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and increasing. In Paul's time, the gospel was in the whole world. And in this case, the word world is cosmos, right? But again, cosmos is not used in the sense of everywhere on the planet. Cosmos is, again, restricted to that heavens and earth region where the church of Colossae was, which is, again, the Roman Empire, basically. And Paul saying that the gospel was, at that time he was writing to Colossae, which we might say 2,000 years ago, the gospel was in the whole world. It was bearing fruit, it was increasing, as also it does among you, since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth. Let's go down to verse 23. Here again about this gospel. It says, if you indeed continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which Paul became a minister. So Paul is saying, look, the gospel was already proclaimed in all the creation under heaven. Again, ancient Near East context. When Paul's talking about all creation under heaven, he's not talking about the tribes down in the Amazon jungle. He's talking about the heavens and earth of the Roman Empire, just like Isaiah was talking about heavens and earth of the Babylonian Empire. Let's look at Acts chapter 2. The day of Pentecost in the year 30. It says there, now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. Do you suppose every nation under heaven here meant people from all over the planet? Or do you suppose it meant the nations which were under the Roman subjugation, encompassed in the Roman Empire? Well, let's see. Let's come down here and see all these nations which were under heaven. Verse 9, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Cyrene, Rome, Jews, Cretans, Arabians. These were the nations under the heaven. And if you look at these nations on the map, you'll see that they are all clustered in northern Africa and what you might call the Middle East. That region, which was really the Roman Empire. You'll find every one of these nations mentioned here were in the Roman Empire at the time of the book of Acts, at the time of the Apostolic Church and the Apostolic ministry, at the time when Jesus said this generation would not pass before all these things were done. Right? That was the world that the gospel would be preached in, and then the end, what end? The end of the age, Matthew 24:3. The end of the age would come, and once the end of the age came, it was not the end of the universe. It was the end of a period of time. And so a new period of time started, which is the new cosmos age, right? The new heavens and earth, under a new priesthood, under a new law. That's what Jesus was speaking about. So as far as we read Matthew's account so far of Jesus' last days prediction for the end of the age, we see that every event was historically fulfilled in that generation, and it was recorded in the book of Acts, in the writings of the apostles. They are telling you these things that Jesus predicted were coming to pass. And also, as I read from the historian Josephus as well, who wrote during that time as an eyewitness as well. These things were coming to pass in that time, in that generation. All right? So this has been the part 1, and the next study, by the will of God, we will look at part 2 of how Jesus' words came to pass historically, as he himself said that they were to come to pass in that generation. And so we have come to the end of this 8th video in the series, The Passing Away of the Heavens and Earth. It was entitled Last Days, Deception and Persecution. And if you appreciate this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You may support the ministry by giving or becoming a Patreon member. There are 4 membership tiers with associated benefits at patreon.com/newcosmos. And if you choose the 2nd, 3rd, or the 4th tiers, you can have access to my videos before they are released on YouTube. If you choose the 3rd or the 4th tier, you can have access to the New Cosmos Masterclass. And I tell you, if you are consistently feeling spiritually dry or powerless, you need this masterclass. And you may also purchase one or all of my books. You may purchase a mug, a t-shirt, a sweater, or a hoodie from the merchandise store. The links for these are in the description. If I remember, put them in the first comment. Until next time, I'm your friend Maurice saying, may God richly bless you.
This has been the New Cosmos Videocast. Remember to comment, like, subscribe, and share.